but we're going to go ahead and switch gears and move to Sarah Lancaster. Sarah is our K-State extension weed scientist, and we've asked her to cover a couple of different topics tonight. We're going to start out discussing herbicide tolerant grain sorghum. Where does that technology fit for us? What kind of weed control can we expect with that? And then we are also asked Sarah to kind of go through and discuss controlling tumble windmillgrass, because it is such a challenge in some of our dryland acres. This grass that is pretty tolerant to, well, it seems like it's a challenge to kill, and it's coming in from the edges of of the fields, from the grass and the pastures and CRP that's next to it. So Sarah, we'll go ahead and get you started. I don't see you or hear you yet. There we go. I see you and I hear you. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry, I just had to move my screen so I could get to you.
Absolutely. Okay, so thanks, Jeannie and Craig and the team for your work to get everything together for these schools and for making the quick pivot when we had the weather situation. And thanks to Cody for agreeing to speak and covering such an important topic and bringing your perspectives and for being flexible with us this week. So with that, I want to jump into talking a little bit about herbicide tolerant grain sorghums and give one more acknowledgement and thank you, and that is to Brent Bean. So the United Sorghum Checkoff has been a very supportive of just this effort to develop herbicide tolerant grain sorghums. And so Brent is an agronomist with USCP, and he has stayed involved in this work. He was in a past life worked as a weed scientist, and so he's been a great supporter for me in this effort and a great help. And when we get to the end of this section of this slide set, we're going to talk about some stewardship stuff related to herbicide tolerant grain sorghums. And Brent was instrumental in leading the charge and developing actually a pamphlet or a little booklet that we can talk about for managing herbicide tolerant grain sorghums. So with that, let's see.
And we can send those booklets out to folks who are interested. Sarah gave me a handful when I was in her office yesterday. So we do have those, and we can get them out to you. Just let us know that you're interested in them.
Awesome. Thanks for that reminder, Jeannie. Okay, so starting with the background here, you guys, if you're growing grain sorghum, you're aware that there are not a lot of herbicide options for grain sorghum. It's just, relative to kind of king corn, it's fewer acres and therefore less economic incentive for the bigger companies in terms of both herbicide development or herbicide registration, as well as transgenic hybrids or herbicide tolerant hybrids. So, I use the term transgenic here on this slide, but it's important to point out that all of the hybrids that we're going to talk about in this section are actually not transgenic. They're non-GMO. So these genes were transferred through conventional breeding programs. So just to kind of get us all on the same page in terms of the history of herbicide tolerant grain sorghum, it started actually at K-State with the discovery at K-State, and then it moved into the industry. So, we've been talking about zest herbicide and enzyme since about 2016 or earlier. Then S&W got into the game in 2018 with their ACCase tolerant. So that would be the double team hybrids. And then iGrowth actually was planted in 2019 in South America and Australia. So, they've got a lot of experience in the field with their hybrids and their systems from those Southern Hemisphere companies. So since 21, 22, we've had herbicide tolerant grain sorghums on the market here in the US. So the next few slides, I just want to step through some characteristics of the hybrids and what we know about availability and market things there. And then we'll talk about the corresponding herbicides. So first up, we've got enzyme. Enzyme is going to be in Pioneer hybrids. Anticipated price is about $360 a bag. They do have one number that they have available now for our region. They're hoping to get some additional hybrids approved in the near future. The herbicide that goes with the Ensign variety or Ensign hybrids is Zest. It's from Corteva. It's about $14 an ounce, which is going to work out to just under $10 an acre, give or take, depending on your retailer and your specific situation. The active ingredient in Zest is nicosulfuron. So you may remember using this in corn as accents many years ago. This is an ALS inhibiting herbicide. It has good grass activity. It has limited broadleaf activity. But the thing to remember about Zest, and this is going to be true for Emiflex as well, is that as ALS inhibiting herbicides, they are kind of the poster children for developing target site specific herbicide resistance. And so this type of resistance develops pretty quickly. And we'll look here in a few slides at some cases where we have found in the plains resistance to these herbicides in some key grasses. So the next system would be the iGrowth system. These hybrids are from Altaseed. Again, about $260 a bag is the suggested retail price. And the statement there is to book early to get the seed you want. No indication as to exactly how much, but these are all newer hybrids and newer systems. So not going to be the greatest availability in terms of comparing availability to other hybrids. The herbicide for the iGrowth system is Emiflex. This product is registered by UPL. Price is going to be about $380 a gallon, which given the use rates takes us down to somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 an acre. The active ingredient in Emiflex is a Mazamox. So same active ingredient as Beyond, which you actually heard Cody talk about in Clearfield wheat just a few minutes ago. Again, it's an ALS inhibiting herbicide. It is in a different herbicide family than nicosulfuron, but we do know that cross resistance to these two families can occur. Not super common, but it can occur. So that'll come into play when we talk about stewardship of these hybrids. Emiflex, of these three, has got the broadest range of activity. It does have grass and broadleaf activity. If you don't have resistant pigweeds, this is the one of the three that will bring some activity on things like Palmer amaranth. It also has longer residual activity than the other two herbicides, and it can be applied either pre or post. This is going to be different than the other two, which are only applied post-emergence. One thing to keep in mind here is that the recommended rate for that is 9 ounces an acre. And please put it out with an acetamide herbicide, a group 15 herbicide. So something like a dual type of herbicide. If you put it out post, it's 6 ounces to the acre. The third system is the double team system. These hybrids are from Sorghum Partners. Cost is going to be about $300 a bag. They expect to have a decent supply, but are encouraging folks to book their seeds early. The herbicide that goes with double team is called First Act. This herbicide is registered by Adama. It costs about $1 an ounce, which brings us to a cost per acre of about $10. The active ingredient in First Act is quizalofop. So we've used that as a shore if you grow soybeans, or we heard Cody talk about aggressor in wheat a few minutes ago. Same active ingredient there. These are ACCase inhibiting herbicides. That's ACCase is the enzyme they target. That enzyme, the active form of that enzyme, is only found in grasses. So First Act only has grass control. One important thing to note is to make sure that you have at least 11-inch sorghum so that we can ensure crop safety. There have been some questions, especially in hotter, humid sorghum growing regions, about crop safety concerns. Also, some pretty strict limitations on tank mix partners with First Act, especially when we think about the group 4 herbicides like 2,4-D or dicamba. We can see some antagonism. So you can lose considerable activity on the grasses as a result of improper tank mixes with First Act. One of the benefits of First Act is that it generally is going to be less prone to developing resistance than ALS inhibiting herbicides. So that would be the herbicides like Imiflex and Zest. So this is some data that does have some Kansas data, also some Nebraska data in there. So these data were collected by Dr. Kumar and Dr. Jala from Hayes and University of Nebraska. So we're looking here at grass control. Okay, so green foxtail control. In this case, the different colored bars represent different rating dates. So we rated at 14, 21, and 35 days after treatment. And it's important to note a couple notes here. They did put atrazine down pre, and pay attention here. The first act was actually applied a week later than the other two treatments. So that would have been a little larger weeds in that case. Okay. So let's step through here the Imiflex treatments, metolachlor, followed by that post-application of Imiflex at 6 ounces. The control really dropped off when we got to 35 days after treatment, but for the first 3 weeks, it was up close to 90% control. Metolachlor and atrazine, followed by first act. So comparing Imiflex to first act here, control was not quite as high. And we also, in this case, saw the drop off at 35 days after treatment. And then looking at Zest, again, control not quite as high as we saw with Imiflex, or in some cases with the first act. So first act, not too surprising actually to see a little bit of an uptick. First act works pretty slowly. I should have pointed that out when we were talking about that set. But metolachlor and atrazine followed by Zest, a little less control than the other two. And again, that same drop off at 35 days after treatment. So a pretty considerable drop off there between the 2-week and the later application dates. So if we look at the Hayes data here, we had greater than 90% control across the board, even on those larger foxtails for the first act application. So a very little drop off here in 2002. So just some differences in the environments there leading to those differences. Looking at the pre-emergence control though, so comparing Imiflex to some of the other options, if you think about Imiflex at that higher rate, looking here at the Clay Center data, again, we have a drop off when we get into that 63-day after treatment, that later application, but we have good control here. 50% control with Imiflex at 9 ounces, Moccasin, which is similar to Dual, 60% control, and then Moccasin plus Imiflex. We had good control. We had almost 90% control here when we got to about 40 days after treatment. The Hayes data, similar to looking at the post-emergence applications, these data all were, in that 90% or greater range of control for Imiflex alone, Moccasin and Moccasin plus Imiflex. And again, similar to the post data, did not see that decrease in weed control there. So I had some studies in these systems as well. Unfortunately, my grass population didn't do what I wanted it to, but we did have Palmer. And so I wanted to share with you guys some of the data from the Imiflex system on Palmer. And so this is going to drive a little bit at one of the points that Cody was making about adjuvants. Okay, so, you guys were talking about Beyond in that case and looking at Beyond with MSO or with MSO plus UAN. So here we're looking at Imiflex, so same active ingredient, different combinations of adjuvants. And so this is something that UPL is really talking about with their herbicide systems, is to fine tune your adjuvant selection here to maximize activity according to your environment. So one thing to note here, we did put Moccasin 2+, so this would be like a dual plus atrazine applied early. And then the Imiflex rate here on all of these was that recommended 6 ounce rate. So if you look, we got decent control with most of these out through, so this would be about 8 weeks after application here, the last bar, okay? So excellent control, greater than 90% NIS plus AMS. But we did get a little better control at those later rating dates with the MSO. And there were no differences with the AMS and the UAN in this case. However, if you look back here at the COC, we did see an increase in control at that later date when we used UAN instead of AMS. So this is kind of driving to that point that Cody was making of, UAN can increase the activity of imazamox, the active ingredient here in Emiflex. And in this case, we saw it with the COC where we saw a little less control with the COC plus AMS. So adding the UAN can bring up our control a notch with some of these herbicides. I mentioned earlier the antagonism that you can see with First Act. And so this is looking at 4-inch giant foxtail in this case. So not a super common weed for Western Kansas, but this slide does a good job of demonstrating what that antagonism can look like. So First Act, that 10-ounce rate of First Act, 80 to 90% control. But when they applied First Act with 2,4-D, pretty much went down to less than 10% control. First Act with Clarity, the control was less and it dropped off over time. So one thing to point out here, there is some other research that looks at how 2,4-D formulation can also affect this antagonism, where we tend to see greater antagonism with the amine formulations compared to the ester formulations. So if you're in a situation where you think you need to apply 2,4-D or dicamba for your broadleaves in a First Act and a double team system, the best thing to do is to make those applications separate. That's actually the recommendation that's coming from ADAMA and S&W, is to separate out those applications. That's the one thing that consistently stops the antagonism there. So just wanted to kind of summarize some of the key points here for these systems. I like to see the high points and kind of look at things this way to make my decisions. So the first column there, we've got the different herbicides, their herbicide group. So you can see that Zest and Emiflex rather are group 2 herbicides compared to First Act being a group 1 herbicide. If you look at the third column for timing, you can see that imazamox is the only one that has a pre-emergence application on the label. And then if you think about effectiveness on grasses, if you do have crabgrass, Zest probably isn't going to be the solution for you. The Ensign, the Emiflex tends to be a little weaker on crabgrass and Sandbur compared to the Quizalofop. If you're thinking about pigweed control out of these products, Emiflex can provide excellent pigweed control if you have a susceptible population. Other things to think about would be cost. Emiflex is priced a little higher than the other 2 products. And then I think 3 keywords for each of those systems would be availability for the Ensign system, adjuvants for using Emiflex in that iGrowth system, and antagonism for using First Act in the double team system. So just some things to think about, hopefully help you guys summarize some of that information to make your decisions. So we're going to spend a few minutes now talking about stewardship. So we worry and we talk a lot about herbicide stewardship across all of our cropping systems. We have to use good herbicide stewardship practices in order for the technologies to last. Tonight, we're talking about herbicide tolerant grain sorghums, but I could be talking about some new herbicide that could be coming out in the next 5 or 10 years. We need to have good stewardship practices. So specific to the grain sorghum, though, one of the things that is really important and really a driver of the stewardship practices is the fact that 2 of our most challenging grassy weeds are very close relatives of grain sorghum. So Johnson grass, sorghum halipens, and shattercane is sorghum bicolor, actually the exact same genus and species as cultivated grain sorghum. So the maps that I've included on this slide were done by Rodrigo Worley when he was at the University of Nebraska. He's my counterpart now at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. But one of the things he did as part of his dissertation work was to do a survey of herbicide resistance in Johnson grass and shattercane. And so if you take a look at this Johnson grass map, with the exception of one population over here in southern Pottawatomie County, our Kansas populations were all susceptible to imazamox and nicosulfuron. Okay. However, when we come up here into Kansas, there were some populations that were resistant to imazamox, and also a couple of populations in south central Kansas that had cross resistance. So they were resistant to both of those herbicides. If we look at the shattercane maps, again, most of our populations here in Kansas that were tested were susceptible. However, as we look here at southern Nebraska, kind of bordering Kansas, so this would be up near Sandra's territory, Sandra's area, we have some populations that are resistant to nicosulfuron and some populations that are resistant to imazamox. And then here in that same sort of south central region of Nebraska, we have those cross-resistant populations again. So just driving home the point that resistance to these herbicides occurred in Johnson grass and shattercane even before we had these herbicide tolerant hybrids. And so just evidence of the importance of stewardship and how easily we could find ourselves having these new technologies that have been so long and coming, being pretty much not useless, but having much less effectiveness for some of our key weeds. So we talked about the fact Johnson grass and shattercane are both very close relatives of grain sorghum. And there's actually evidence that cross-pollination can occur. So we can have the pollen from our herbicide-tolerant grain sorghums floating around and pollinating seeds of Johnson grass or shattercane. And then we would likely have herbicide-tolerant Johnson grass and shattercane as a result of that outcrossing. So we're going to go through about 11 different things to consider in terms of herbicide stewardship. Some of these, for example, this first item would apply to any type of cropping system, herbicide tolerant or not. And that is to use a pre-emergence herbicide. So in grain sorghum, those group 15 herbicides, things like metolachlor, are really the backbone of our grass control in those systems. So making sure you have a good strong dose of an effective pre-emergence grass herbicide is critical for all grain sorghum in general and for these systems in particular. Point number 2, again, would apply to any type of weed control system, and that is to control grasses when they're small. Especially, we looked at the weakness of some of those herbicides on crabgrass. Getting that crabgrass when it's a little smaller can help increase the effectiveness of those applications. And this is just some data from Dr. Kumar's program at Hayes, where we're looking at control of green foxtail at 4 inches versus 12 inches. Okay. So if you look across here at the 4-inch bars, those dark purple bars, every one of those bars is 70% or greater. Even for zest, which we talked about, generally has a little bit less effectiveness on, sorry, we were talking about large crabgrass when we said less effectiveness. But all of them are greater than 70% for that 4-inch. If you come here to the gray bars, though, we drop down to really less than 30% control for 12-inch foxtail. So weed size is critical for all of our herbicides, including these herbicides and herbicide-tolerant grain sorghum. Item number 3, don't use these technologies if you know you have plants that are already resistant. So if you're in one of those areas or near one of those areas where, for example, resistance to nicosulfuron has already been found, these herbicide tolerant grain sorghums are not going to be for you. So don't use if those grasses are present in the field. You're just going to create more problems. Point number 4, control Johnson grass and shattercane in the field. So it's important to note that Johnson grass and shattercane are not actually on the labels for these herbicides. So you should not apply these herbicides with the intention of controlling Johnson grass and chattercane for all the reasons we've talked about in terms of the resistance potential there. The really most important thing to think about, though, in terms of stopping that pollen flow is to make sure that Johnson grass and chattercane are not flowering at the same time that the grain sorghum is trying to pollinate. Okay, so we know that grain sorghum is going to have pollen shed for about 10 days from that main head. Of course, if you've got tillers, that's going to make that a little bit longer time period there. We also know that chattercane can flower for about 6 to 22 days. So that's, the time period when you're really watching for that chattercane. And then Johnson grass, given its growth from the rhizomes, can flower over a much longer period of time. So making sure that we don't have grain sorghum pollen shed while we've got chattercane and Johnson grass flowering in or near the field is very important. So in addition to managing those weeds in the field, it's very important to manage those weeds near the field. Yes, I recognize this can come into conversations with neighbors or with, county road maintenance folks, but it's important to make sure that you don't have those weeds flowering at the same time as your herbicide tolerant grain sorghum. We know, for example, in the state of Texas, the guidelines for certified seed there for grain sorghum say that suggest that 400 feet is their threshold, but really there's no set distance to know how far that pollen is going to travel. So you just want to get as much distance as possible between herbicide tolerant grain sorghum and any related weeds. And again, the goal is just to keep things from flowering at the same time. And quite frankly, something as simple as mowing can be used to accomplish that goal. Item number 6, control volunteers. If you have volunteers emerge the next year, you are going to have the same issues with cross-pollination from that volunteer grain sorghum. So you don't want that volunteer to be pollinating Johnson grass or chattercane. Number 7, this is another one that applies to all cropping systems, and that would be to scout for escapes. If you think you have resistance, treat the escapes with a different herbicide so that you can control it and or use non-chemical weed control. So Cody did a great job talking about all the various types of weed management that we can use. So think about some of those other tools. Here's where I insert jokes about great activities for ornery teenage kids is to go out and rogue weeds from the field. So the next item, number 8, is if you don't control your grasses, you need to let folks know. The first folks you need to let know are the crop protection companies, so UPL, Adama, Corteva. They have an obligation to manage herbicide resistance, so they need to know. And also, as the state specialist for weed science, I strongly believe that I have an obligation to help farmers understand where herbicide-resistant populations occur and best management practices for eradicating or controlling them. Eradication is really not an option, controlling them. So please do get in touch with your extension agent or get in touch with myself directly so we can have some conversations and just have greater awareness of the situation so we can help everyone in our communities. Point number 9, something that in Kansas we don't use a lot of, and that would be to think about harvest aids for grain sorghum. One of the things that this can do is help control weeds that may have produced seed later in the season. So hopefully we could suppress weed seed production of the grasses by using a harvest aid. Item number 10, this is a pretty low cost thing you can do, is just to make sure you're tarping grain trucks because as this picture shows, spills can result in volunteers. And then we have the concern of the pollen being spread from those volunteers. Item number 11. Really, this to me is one of the most important features on this list. Not that the others were not important, but this one is so important. And that would be to rotate crops and chemistries. So remember that all of these herbicides that we're using for herbicide tolerant grain sorghums are labeled in other crops. And so be very intentional about your hybrid selection so that you are getting the best fit in terms of which of these herbicides you're using in which cropping system. So if you're going after goat grass, according to Cody's data earlier, it looks like maybe Beyond is what you need to use. So then let's think about using First Act for our grain sorghum. Just making sure that we are rotating crops and chemistries. And I know that gets to be a challenge, but it's so, so important, and important to keep good records of what you're doing in this regard as well, so you don't control your crop by spraying the wrong herbicide. So 3 key points from those last 25 minutes or so here. Herbicide resistant or herbicide tolerant grain sorghums are great additional tools, but don't think they're silver bullets. Each of those 3 systems has strengths and weaknesses that you need to think about for your operation. These products are going to require careful stewardship. And then just kind of the disclaimer here, we hit the high points on that slide set. So make sure you're looking at the label to make sure you have the most detailed recommendations that you need. Okay. Let's take questions all at once at the end, I think, for the sake of time, unless Jeannie or Craig, you guys think otherwise.
I think let's keep rolling, Sarah.
All right, let's do it.
And if anybody has questions, real quick, if anyone has questions on what we just discussed with herbicide tolerant sorghum, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. If you're on Zoom, if you're on YouTube, put them in the chat box or send an email to me with them, and then we'll get them to Sarah.
Awesome. So we're going to roll on through, pun not intended, tumble windmillgrass. So this is a weed that I have gotten quite a few questions on in my short time here at K-State. To be honest, it was a weed that I wasn't familiar with until I came to Kansas and started learning more about the no-till cropping systems here in Western Kansas. So we've got 4 kind of things we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about identification. We're going to talk about biology of the weed. We'll look at some of the existing information on management, and then we're going to talk about some preliminary results from a study that I have been working on near Russell. So background information about tumble windmillgrass. It's actually a native plant. Okay, so that's part of why it grows so well. It belongs here. But what happens is, through tillage or perhaps through overgrazing, we have created disturbance that has allowed this plant to start to take over and become problematic in our managed cropping systems. It's not super particular as to what type of soil it grows in. It does prefer full sun. So, competitive crops are always a good management tool to think about. Other things to know is it's a bunch grass. It grows in clumps, but those clumps can grow in large colonies. So it actually it's a perennial. It has short little rhizomes, shallow rhizomes, and it also regrows from the crown. So it can actually form colonies that look pretty much like turf grass. So if we think about identification here, leaves tend to be relatively short, about 6 inches long and pretty narrow. These leaves are going to be folded in the bud. They're really flat. So hopefully you can see from this picture how flat those leaves are down here at the leaf sheath. So the leaf sheaths several leaves can be sheathed together. So if you look at the base of one of these plants, it ends up looking sort of like a palm leaf or a fan, like the paper fans where they all come out together. Other things that can be identifying features. I chose this picture because I think you can see pretty well this kind of transparent stripe along the edge of that sheath. That's a little membrane, just a transparent membrane that runs down the entire length of that sheath. So that's a pretty unique characteristic. Another characteristic that you might be able to use, there's a fringe of longer hairs there near the ligule. The ligule is going to be real short, just a membranous at the base, but a fringe of hairs across the top. So it might look like the ligule has hairs. So as other identification pieces here, it will shoot up a flowering stalk. So most of the leaves are going to be pretty short, 6 inches or less, but it will shoot up these flowering stalks that can get up to about 15 inches tall. On these flowering stalks, you'll see a few kind of scattered leaves that are going to alternate along that stalk. Another thing to note is that at the nodes on that flowering stalk, it can produce adventitious roots. So just another way for it to spread. Panicles are going to have 10 to 16 branches. So you can see them here in this photo. And they're going to be in whorls, which you can see here in the photo on the right-hand side of your screen as that panicle has kind of opened up a little bit. So you can see they're in whorls around. You can see hopefully 3 different sets of whorled branches in that panicle. And the reason this plant gets its name, so windmill from the look of the panicle, but also the tumble part of that comes from the fact that this panicle, about where the fingers are in this picture, is going to break off and basically tumble across the ground. And that's one of the ways that it distributes seed. So it is technically one of the tumbleweeds that we can see here in the plains. When you think about the spikes or the seeds, the spikes themselves are about 2 inches long. And then each of the spikelets are going to be sort of V-shaped. So hopefully you can see that here in the picture on the upper right corner. The photo to the left shows the coloring. They tend to be green to kind of maybe a reddish tint. And then as they mature, they are going to turn brown. One thing to note here, this is a wind pollinated weed. And so it will cross with related species. And so species that can cross like that tend to have pretty variable characteristics. So I've tried to pick the ones that are going to be consistent for you guys to use for identification, but just know that because it can cross with related species, we could see a range of characteristics for this weed. Tumble windmillgrass is a warm season grass. And I mentioned before, it is a perennial. So it can regrow from the crowns, which you can see here in this picture. It also has short rhizomes. So rhizomes, the roots coming from those adventitious nodes there as well. Okay. So what do we know about controlling tumble windmillgrass? We know that it's not super challenging to control when it's a seedling. So when I first started getting questions and comments about tumble windmillgrass, I did what every good weed nerd does and started looking in the published literature to see what was out there. And the first paper I came across was this paper that was done here at K-State. Phil Stallman's on the paper, Dallas Peterson, Kasim, they're all on this paper done by a graduate student. And I thought, well, what do you mean? They got 100% control of this stuff across all their treatments. Then I went back and read the methods of the paper and found that they were controlling seedling tumble windmillgrass in this case. So tumble windmillgrass as a seedling is relatively controllable, okay? But when we look at mature plants, now this was a greenhouse study, not a field study, but they were looking at more mature plants to check control. And instead of showing you a percent weed control here, I'm showing you the number of tillers per plant. Okay, so this is their non-treated check here, this light gray bar at the end, how many tillers it had. So, we want the smallest number of, or the shortest bar here for everything else to the left. So they sprayed glyphosate, 2 different rates, and then they sprayed 3 different grass herbicides. So those ACCase inhibiting herbicides. So post, select, or I'm sorry, a clethodim formulation that I'm assuming was regular select, and then Assure 2. Okay, so they sprayed all 3 of those. So take a look here at the seedling control, very good control for the seedlings. But then when they applied the herbicides, when the windmillgrass was tillering or when the windmillgrass was heading, they had much more tiller growth, so much less control relative to applications at the seedling growth stage. And so then the next step of this study that they did is they tried to look at why. And what they found is that translocation is greatly reduced after tillering starts. So once that plant starts to tiller, it stops moving the herbicide around in the plant, and effectively you're spraying a herbicide that needs to be translocated through the plant to be effective, but it's moving in the plant like a contact herbicide, so it's not effective. So I then went on and looked at some other data and found from the turfgrass world some greenhouse studies where they were looking at group 27 herbicides. So here we've got mesotrione, and tepramazone applied with and without triclopyr. Okay, so this is another case where they were looking at above ground biomass. And so we want a small bar here. And so some of the best control was when they applied the mesotrione, so Callisto or tepramazone. So in our world, that would be impact with triclopyr. So they sprayed that when they had 10 to 15 tillers on those plants. So that's fairly decent size clump of tumble windmillgrass. What they did though is after they collected that above ground biomass, so they clipped that off as the surface, and then they watered those plants again and let it regrow. And 2 weeks after, they did see some regrowth in some of these treatments, but again, the mesotrione with triclopyr and the tepramazone plus triclopyr had much less regrowth than the other plants. So that's sending some signals that maybe these are some herbicides that we should be looking at in field studies. So that last study was done in the greenhouse. This study, these data come from a thesis that was done in the horticulture department here at K-State. So they were looking at similar treatments. They had things with and without triclopyr. They had some mesotrione. They had some tepramazone. They had some other products in there. But one of the things that they found is that the season of application of herbicides had an influence on the control that they got. So they had 2 locations. They had Junction City and Onega, and then they applied herbicides either in the fall, in the summer, or in the spring. Okay, and here's what they found. So this is percent tumble windmillgrass cover. So did they shrink the clump size of those tumble windmillgrass clumps? And what these data suggest is that herbicide applications in the spring, in this case, were more effective at reducing the size of those tumble windmillgrass clumps compared to herbicide applications made in the fall or the summer. So that's a little counterintuitive when we think about kind of the general rules of thumb for managing perennial weeds. A lot of times we'll say if it's a perennial, we want to make that application later in the season so that we can take advantage of how the herbicide is translocated in the plant. But remember, we're dealing with a plant that doesn't translocate the herbicides. So those spring applications actually looked like they were a little bit better. Other things we know as we think about cultural control, we know that tumble windmillgrass can be resistant to fire. That actually increases the growth of tumble windmillgrass. But we do know that tillage can suppress tumble windmillgrass. So Augustino Bohr and some other folks at Hayes have a long-term no-till trial, and they have tumble windmillgrass as one of the key weeds in that trial. And so they were looking at this idea of strategic tillage or reduced tillage to try to manage tumble windmillgrass. And much like the data that Cody was showing for downy brome, it looks like strategic tillage, so occasional tillage, can be an effective way to suppress tumble windmillgrass. The other piece of the study is that they were looking at some soil health parameters because they didn't want to lose the benefits of no-till. And in most cases, they actually found that they did not lose the soil health benefits of no-till by occasional tillage to manage the weeds. And so that leads us to the study that we've been working on in Russell. So we took a field that was conventionally tilled, and it was in a wheat sorghum fallow rotation. We divided our study area into 3 sections, but we're only going to talk about 2. So we had a no-till section of the study. We had a section of the study that we ran sweet plows. That was done on April 27th, about 4 to 5 inches deep. So I recognize that that April 27th date is not aligned with one of the kind of standard recommendations that have been developed for tumble windmillgrass, and that is to run the sweeps when it's really hot and dry outside, so you can kick up those tumble windmillgrass clumps and dry out the roots. But my thinking was we can dislodge those plants, weaken those plants in the spring when they're starting to grow, and then come back with a late spring herbicide application and see if we can kind of do a double knock approach here to 2 punches to try to get better control of these weeds. So Craig got in on the action when we were spraying these plots. So we sprayed, the data we're going to show tonight is going to come from the plots that we sprayed on June 3rd. We also sprayed some of the treatments with a second shot of either Roundup or Select on September 12th. So looking at kind of a late spring, early summer application, followed by a late summer, early fall type of application. The herbicides that we used were Roundup Power Max 2. We had Select Max. We used Callisto, Impact, and Sinnate. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Sinnate here in just a minute. And then for the last 3, for the group 27 herbicides, Callisto, Impact, and Sinnate, we applied those with and without Remedy Ultra. So this is some background for you guys on Sinnate because it is a newer product. It's basically Impact plus Liberty. It has a label in corn. And in fact, AMVAC is considering developing some formal recommendations to use Sinnate for windmillgrass control in corn. So these are some data from my herbicide evaluation trials in Manhattan, just to give you a feel for what it does. It does have pretty good grass activity, no matter which of the ways we looked at it. So Sinnate by itself, Sinnate with atrazine, a higher rate of Sinnate, and then here's the 2 components broken out, and then there's Impact with Power Max and atrazine. So Sinnate can be effective on grasses. So other things, we rated these plots on July 8th, August 8th, and September 12th. We're rating them again after the fall applications. We've got the trial area planted to wheat right now, and we'll collect some additional ratings here once things start to green up in the spring. So I chose this picture for the slide because I wanted to show you, this is the middle section of that trial where we used a moldboard plow. There is still no tumble windmillgrass growing in that section. So I know that that's not necessarily a very desirable method for folks, but if you're talking about, preserving the outside of a field from encroachment from the road banks, maybe that's something that could be a fit for some folks. Data analysis, we looked at it in terms of what did the tillage systems do? We looked at how did the herbicides perform? And then we looked at the interactions of tillage and herbicides. And so that's the data we're going to spend the next few minutes taking a look at. So main effect of tillage here, in every case, we found that obviously the sweep plow was better than the no-till treatment. So that means that we did get a boost in our weed control from our herbicides by using the sweep plow prior to application. So here's just some examples. So I need to move some things around so I can remember what I'm showing you here. So these photos were taken on September 12th. The picture on the left is the Select treatment. In the no-till plots, the picture on the right is the Select treatment in the sweep plowed plots. Clearly the Select did not control the Palmer amaranth, but you can see a definite reduction in the size of the green area in those tumble windmillgrass plots. So I also wanted to show you guys, so this is Callisto plus Remedy in the no-till and Callisto plus Remedy in the sweep plowed section. So this was one of the areas where we saw a big difference in the treatments here. So I put this little star here to remind me to tell you that there was a statistically significant difference in the weed control between these 2 plots. So you can see here nearly a mat of the windmill grass and the no-till plots However, when we come over to the sweet till plots, you can see to the line where we made that herbicide application in those plots. So now looking at results kind of pooled over the two tillage systems for the different herbicides. Let's look here at the 12-week applications because the trends were pretty similar. We've got in each of these cases 3 treatments that are standing out as being a little bit better, as being better than the others statistically. And so those 3 treatments that are standing out are the Synate plus remedy, and then that Select Max treatment. So 3 treatments that seem to have some promise over the other herbicides. So these photos here, Callisto plus remedy with the sweet plow. So we looked at those. Here's what I wanted to show you. So we've got Callisto plus remedy in the no-till. We've got Impact plus remedy in the no-till plots. And then we've got Synate plus remedy in the no-till plots. And so I just wanted you to see the difference between those 3 different growth HPPD inhibiting herbicides across those no-till plots. And you can really see here the Synate plus remedy. Again, you can pretty much see to the line where I walked with the backpack sprayer. So looking at the interactions now, we've got all of our herbicide treatments in no-till, all of our herbicide treatments in the sweet plow. This is the September 12th rating. And in both systems, those last 3 treatments really stood out. So the Synate plus remedy, and the Select. And it's interesting the boost we get in those Synate treatments relative to in the sweet plow relative to the no-till plots. So thinking about future directions here, we are going to keep monitoring these plots. We ran out and took some photos here just recently. And so what I've got for you here is the 2 passes of Select. So the plot on the left, the picture on the left, rather, that plot had Select in June and Select in September. And that's what it looked like a couple of weeks ago. And then the Synate plus remedy plot in the sweet plow, not quite as sharp in terms of weed control as what we're seeing in that 2 passes of Select treatment. So, not complete control here, but definitely things to keep us optimistic, and maybe we can get ahead of this weed a little bit. But I think one of the things to remember on this weed is that those clumps are going to grow that are left are going to grow very quickly. And so, if you go then into a fallow phase here for this, or some other situation where you're controlling it a little less, it's going to come back aggressively. So we're going to continue to monitor it. We're thinking about maybe potentially other locations. Some of the other agents have asked about making some modifications to the treatment structure and looking at this at some other locations. And then the third piece here is timing of tillage. So comparing these spring plowing with a more traditional summertime plowing to see if we get any differences in those effects. And with that, we are approaching the 1-hour mark here, and I appreciate everyone's attention. I just wanted to point out that we can leave you with a electronic version of the chemical weed control guide tonight, or we can, please feel free to reach out. You can find me on email or on social media, or as always, going to plug the War Against Weeds podcast, where we talk about all things weed science, including some episodes on adjuvants. That was a topic that was brought up tonight that is on my mind as a pretty good episode to listen to. So with that, Jeannie, I wanted to make sure and leave time for questions, comments, or other feedback.
Okay, guys, so let's put your questions into the Q&A box or into the chat box, and we will get rolling here with questions. Sarah, I have one to get us started here. Looking at the dry conditions that we had this last year and the tillage part of that, what kind of a interaction do you think was carrying on with that? Because, sometimes we struggle to get anything to grow this summer in some cases.
Yeah, I think there was definitely a piece there. One of the data pieces that I should have showed you would have been the non-treated in the sweet till versus the non-treated in the no-till area. And there were differences there in that we did see some suppression of the windmillgrass just by virtue of running the sweeps. And, you know, we ran the sweeps in April before things got too crazy dry, but we did also, you know, after that point in time, make it very difficult for that windmillgrass to reestablish. So yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and that drives at the theory of, you know, running the sweeps late in the season, right? If we can uproot that plant when it's difficult for it to grow, you know, that can be an effective management tool. So yeah, that's a good question. I appreciate that, Jeannie.
Well, I know that we're struggling to get a handle on this on this weed. And so, you know, as I'm thinking through the biology on it and how it handles stuff, you know, hitting it in the spring seems to make sense, you know, to at least weaken it. And, you know, this is in some cases not a one shot to go after this tumble windmillgrass. In some cases we can get it, but in other cases, you know, it's native to the area. It's very adapted. And we think about, you know, the root systems under them. You only have to put a spade in the ground just a few inches and can slide right underneath that root system. And so we always, you know, when Sarah and I have these conversations, we joke about how drought tolerant this is and how it spends a lot of its life probably fairly drought stressed.
That's right. And so that's, you know, coming into play when we think about this, the challenges that we have with managing windmillgrass, right? It's adapted to a semi-arid environment. And so it's going to be challenging to get herbicides into that plant. And I mean, it kind of seems to shut down a little bit as a survival strategy there in terms of what the translocation does as that plant matures. So super interesting.
Sarah, sometimes I get questions on using paraquat with this weed, burning all the leaves off of it. Is that an effective strategy with it, or should we, I mean, are we going to have a lot of regrowth with it, or do we pair it with really dry conditions and that's the control for it?
I haven't seen paraquat much in the field. I know if I'm thinking about some field visits that you and I made, though, there is a farmer that's in my mind that has been fairly successful at managing it in his no-till operation. And it seems like that is an important piece of his operation. I think some things to be aware of, though, is that consistent control is going to, or consistent effort, whatever your control practice is going to be needed. And I think, you know, all of the things about paraquat and spray volume and making sure you get coverage down into that clump of the windmillgrass is going to be really important, Jeannie.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Do we have any other questions? I have other agents online that I can't see the chat box. Erin or Sandra, do we have any questions coming in on YouTube? Or Craig, do you see any questions?
No, we're good.
Okay.
That I see of.
Okay.
And one thing I might mention, going back to the herbicide tolerant grain sorghum, I know you mentioned some of the populations that already had resistance. I believe Vipin confirmed some ACCA resistant shatter cane, like in Graham County, I believe, in 2021.
Yeah, I didn't have those data, Craig, but I remember seeing some things coming through where they were screening some populations in the greenhouse, and he had one that was a hit. I don't remember if he went through like all the confirmation steps or if it was just a screening and it's less sensitive. So yeah, it's a very real thing, and it's very easily in our area, or very likely could be in our area.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Thanks for reminding me of that. Yeah, thank you.
Alrighty.
Excellent.
Okay, with that, if you guys have questions for Sarah, please reach out to her on the tumble windmillgrass topic or the herbicide tolerant grain sorghum. We're, you know, these are kind of hot topics right now that we're continuing to get questions on. And so if you have a follow-up question, or, tomorrow morning, you're like, man, I should ask Sarah that, let us know. We'll happy to get questions funneled to Sarah and get those answered. So, with that, thank you, Sarah, for sharing this recent research there in Russell, and hopefully we'll have more locations out this next year to see what else we can do to get a handle on it. I guess with that, we're putting a plug in. We're looking for locations. If you have a really nice stand, a Tumble Windmillgrass, let us know, because we're looking for spots to put some more research out for that.
Yes, thanks for that plug, Jeannie.